This is probably the biggest get of all gets. I'm here with Sandy Thurman. And first, I'm going to let you, how would you introduce Sandy Thurman?
That's a hard one, but I think Sandy Thurman. I'm a native of Atlanta. I am a student of politics. I'm an activist. I'm a feminist, and pretty big lover of people. And I think that was probably it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of not the it. So, Sandy, you have been were you the founding executive director of Aid Atlanta?
No, but I was the executive director.
Okay, who's the founding executive director?
It was the founding executive director, or the founder was a guy named Graham Bruton, and then there was Ken South.
Okay.
So I think
oh
Ken
my God,
South
I
was
remember
our first,
Ken South.
Yes, was our
His
first
glasses and right.
Yeah.
I know Ken. Yeah.
He was our first executive director.
Okay. And then were you next?
No, there was another young man, Buren Batson,
Okay.
who succeeded Ken. And there was a woman in the early days, somebody that I can't remember, that was only there for a little while when it was just a startup. Mm-hmm. And then I came afterwards, so I became executive director in 1988.
All right. And how long did you stay there?
For 4 years, almost 5 years, and then I went to the Carter Center to work.
Okay, and then that was Sandra McDonald came after you. Is that right?
She was never executive. She was on the board of Aid Atlanta, but she was never executive director. She was executive director of, I can't remember, a different organization that really focused on the African American community.
Okay, and I think a lot of people kind of always did that thing, right? With Aid Atlanta. What made you take on the role of ED at Aid Atlanta at that time?
Well, I had sort of grown up in the midst of the gay community, and I had a lot of friends who were impacted by AIDS in the early days, and that came right after a time that I had studied hospice with a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, so I was able to keep my father at home since we didn't have really good hospice care back in those days in Atlanta. So it came on the tail end of the epidemic, sort of really emerged on the tail end of my caring for my father, and then impacted a whole lot of people that I loved and had been in my life all my life. And I started as a volunteer in late 92, I guess, and maybe 93, I can't remember, as a volunteer, and then started doing some fundraising and policy work for Aid Atlanta as a volunteer, and then came on board full-time in 1988.
Now, it's funny, you bring up Kubler-Ross, and I am thinking that a lot of people don't know Kubler-Ross's work and Louise Hay's work around and a lot of people in the early days of the HIV movement, epidemic, life, used folks like the work of Kubler-Ross and Louise Hay as like some of the first like holistic and natural work. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, we did. I mean, you have to remember that at the beginning of the epidemic, we had no treatments of any kind. There was no treatment. We didn't have a cure. AIDS was primarily a fatal disease in the early days of the epidemic. And so what we were doing, and the reason that a number of programs like Aid Atlanta were built not on a medical model but on a social service model of care, was because we were doing palliative care. And so icons in that and pioneers in that work like Louise Hay and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross were our go-tos in terms of caring for people in a respectful and loving way at the end of their life.
Now, so I say often that I don't believe that people have a visual acuity of AIDS, the AIDS that we remember. They don't remember or have an experience where I remember. It's why I can't go to funerals to this day, that I was going to about 10 funerals a week. And I was like, when I buried my best friend, I said, that's it. I'm done. Unless you're a bloodline family member, not going. And I've had a few exceptions. And one of the people we're going to talk about in a bit here is A. Cornelius Baker, who I know was a very, very, very dear. I won't even just call him a friend. I think he was probably more of a family member for you.
He was.
But I think that folks don't know or remember things like wasting syndrome or like KS or buffalo hump. Folks don't remember before AZT. I don't even think people remember AZT, right? So can you talk about kind of what that world was like? I mean, the wild, wild west world of getting folks access to care and treatment in this country.
It was the wild, wild west, and it was particularly the wild, wild west in the South. It wasn't like San Francisco or New York or Los Angeles that had very open gay communities, had very well-established large LGBTQ centers at the time. Atlanta wasn't that place. We were in the middle of the Bible Belt. People were still not talking about homosexuality very, openly, and not dealing with it in the public space well at all. Of course, everyone in the world knew the people who were gay, but no one talked about it. I mean, it's the South. So when AIDS emerged, people forget it was a grisly, gruesome, awful way to die. And it manifested quickly, and people got incredibly sick, and there was very little we could do for them except provide palliative care and some symptomatic treatment. There wasn't anything that was specific to AIDS, and people died often alone. And so we had to develop all of these huge networks of people who were often infected themselves, who were helping other people who were sick. It was extraordinary. When I was at AIDS Atlanta, I think we had, probably 20 staff, and we had 1,000 volunteers. Mm-hmm. So most of what we were doing was, sort of case management and managing volunteers who were extensions of our work. So we didn't have any money either. But it was ugly in ways I think people can't even imagine. It was literally like a war zone, to your point. We were burying people every single day. Mm-hmm. And the impact that had on the community and the care providers and the people that worked with us was, extraordinary and painful. Right. But people managed to work through it. And I think we don't remember that, and a lot of folks who are in the business don't remember what that was like.
Right. You are, I would say, the consummate Southern belle, right? I would imagine, I want to know, I'm going to learn a little bit more about also how you grew up, but I've always seen you that way. And I imagine kind of that this was a thing that allowed you to get into rooms and places and spaces that others could not. And so I want you to tell me about that and whether that assumption is true or accurate. And then I also want you to tell me, because if I remember this correctly, you've worked for both Republican and Democratic administrations, right?
Yes.
So what's that, you being that Southern belle, that lets you get into those spaces, and how's that been?
Well, it's interesting. I think that I was lucky to be able to utilize the fact that the cover of the book doesn't exactly describe the book itself. Mm-hmm. But that's always, most of the time, worked to my advantage. Mm-hmm. And my father used to have a very funny story. He would say to people, and people have printed this before, he'd say, the good news is that but by the time they figure out my daughter has a brain, she has their check in the bank and their signature on the dotted line. Because they're looking at me and seeing a lot of blonde and a lot of pearls, and that was about it. However, that worked to my advantage, and it worked to the advantage of my work in policy, because early on in the epidemic, when we were looking at passing the Ryan White Care Act, which is our biggest provider of care in the domestic AIDS epidemic, the majority of appropriators and authorizers in the United States Congress were from south of the Mason-Dixon line. Mm-hmm. They were not particularly welcoming to some gay activists coming into the room. But when someone like me walked into the room, they were more than happy to have a conversation. It also didn't hurt that my mother was chairman of the Democratic Party and my family had been involved in politics for decades. So, and I knew in the South, so it wasn't that we had a Democratic and Republican Party. In the old days, we had conservatives and progressive folk in the same party. We had Lester Maddox, who was the next, handle-carrying crazy governor, and Andy Young in the same political party.
Right.
So I mean, that's how I learned how to work with everybody. So I looked like this. I didn't look like an AIDS activist to anybody. I came in my pearls. I had a Southern accent. I had all kinds of blonde hair, and I could get almost anything out of folks because I also understood the policy.
Right.
So it was. They just took people off guard, and I think it served me and the work that I've done very well. And I said, and one of the things I always laugh about, I said, the thing that used to aggravate me most in my life is that people would say that I got, I was successful or I got into a room because of my looks. And it used to really make me mad because I was reasonably smart. And then the thing that made me even madder than that is when they stopped saying that. It's like the real slap in the face. I was like, damn. I didn't appreciate it at the time.
So let's talk a little bit about who is Sandy Thurman, because I don't know that I know that, right? So you've said a few times that your family was in politics in I'm gonna imagine in Georgia because you're born and raised here, but where did you go to school? What did you do? You got married? You got kids? You got a dog? You got a horse? What do you got? Who is Sandy Thurman? Because I think people may know you from afar, right? But they don't know who Sandy Thurman is.
No. So I went to school in Georgia. I went to Mercer University in Macon and finished in Atlanta. I got married when I was very young, 22, to a very smart, wonderful lawyer. And we divorced after a few years and remained best friends to this day, so that was nice. I started work, my first job was as a counselor in the labor department. And I worked was a counselor in a program that worked with ex-offenders. So I worked in the prison system. I always knew I'd do something in social work or in, social justice. That's what I wanted to do.
Was that like an ethos of your family? Was that like a thread of your family?
It was.
Both
my parents were lawyers. My father didn't practice law. My mother did. She was a very successful trial lawyer. She was chairman of the Democratic Party. The whole family was involved in the civil rights movement. And so it was the sort of ethos of where I grew up that just sort of, led me into this area of work. In fact, when I went to work at AID Atlanta, I had actually applied to law school. I was first not going to be a lawyer because both my mother and my husband were such successful lawyers. And I don't think I'm as smart as either one of them. And so I thought, well, I'm not sure I want to do that. And then I thought, well, I would love to do that. I'm smart enough. I can work at legal aid. I'll do something, meaningful to me. And so I went to work at AID Atlanta when they asked me to, because at the time we all thought the epidemic would be over in a couple of years. And so I deferred going to law school to go to work at AID Atlanta, and here 40-something years later, I'm still doing it. Oops.
Yeah.
So the best laid plans don't necessarily work out the way you think. Right. So, yeah.
Who's the first person that you knew that had AIDS?
Actually, the first person, good friends of my mother and mine died very early. And then I got asked to go down and actually, my first hands-on caring for someone was an infant that was born at Grady Hospital. And someone asked me if I would come down and take care of the baby because other people didn't want to touch it. And I said, well, of course, I don't even know much about infants. I mean, I'm good with animals. I like little humans that can talk to me. I'm scared of the little ones that can't talk. But I thought, oh my gosh, I'll go down and volunteer. So I did. But it wasn't very long after that. Many friends that I knew were infected and died quickly. And I started working, helping people or training people how to do at-home care. based on a hospice model. And then after that, I realized that we needed to raise some money, and somebody needed to talk to the legislature and the city council and the commission and others about some money. And no one that I knew had the skills to do that but me. And so it was a total accident that I wound up in this work. Total accident.
Right. So, I try to ask a couple of hard questions too. This, the work that we do, I think, has changed over time, where leadership has been predominantly gay white men in many cases. And then it was this swing, and it swung kind of the other way, where it's been predominantly men of color. Now, I know I've had my own experience as a woman of color in the HIV space. What has been the negative of being a white woman who's heterosexual, not living with HIV, doing HIV work?
Well, recently it hasn't been so bad. But in the beginning of the epidemic, when I first went to AIDS Atlanta, there was an enormous amount of resentment on the part of some particularly affluent A-list gay boys who were not at all happy that they had selected a woman to be a straight woman to be the head of AIDS Atlanta. There was a whole lot of sort of in that group some underlying misogyny. There was some woman-hating stuff, and then they really hated it because I was in the same circles. I was traveling in the same circles they were. They really hated that, and so they did all kinds of ugly things. They called up my board chair's husband, who was also a straight woman who was working at the Visiting Nurse Association, and told her husband that we were having an affair. Accused us of being lesbians, which would have been fine. I mean, fortunately, her husband was someone I had known since childhood,
right?
And knew some of my proclivities were probably not in that direction,
right?
And so he got a big kick out of it, and so we got really some ugly kind of backlash, both my board chair and I during that time. But as time went on, when we were successful, people didn't say much about it, and when people realized that I might be able to open doors that somebody else couldn't, then people were a little more tolerant. Right. And when they figured out that I had been raised in the gay community, and again, when I went, we already owned, my husband and I owned a gay bar, more than one, when I went to work at AIDS Atlanta. So we had pretty good credentials and roots in the community. So I was lucky that I had that advantage. Right. If I had not had that advantage, I think it would have been harder.
Right. So I want to stick with this for a minute, and then I do want to talk about your ownership, but I want to talk about, because I remember it wasn't you so much that I read about it, but it was, and I'm trying now to remember her last name, and forgive me. It was, her first name was Pat, and she was at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation.
Yes. Oh my gosh, what's your last name?
And I will, by the time we go to print with this, I will have remembered her last name. And I, hopefully somebody can look it up while I'm still sitting here. But I remember almost weekly in the Bay Area Reporter was this woman's salary. And I kept thinking, this is crazy. And I kept thinking it was crazy because I kept thinking they would not publish a man's salary this way. Nor have I ever really seen it.
Pat Christian.
Pat Christian. There you go. Yep, Pat Christian. Pat Christian at San Francisco AIDS Foundation. And I remember, and I can tell you my honest thought. My honest thought was, Jesus, if they're doing this to a white woman, if I ever made over $100,000, they'd crucify me.
Of course.
So did you experience kind of that sort of backlash? Because, I mean, I think sometimes what people don't understand is that as these organizations grew in size and scale, that it wasn't that the individual running the organization was in some sort of profit share deal, right? But it does require a lot of work. Did you get kind of negative feedback just by your salary or your being or what have you?
More of my being, because Pat was making a lot more money than we were, because I needed to raise the money to pay myself at Aid Atlanta. So, and she did too. And San Francisco AIDS Foundation was bigger than Aid Atlanta at that time. But what I did get was a lot of grief in the papers, the gay rags about the car I drove. I drove a BMW, and people thought I was siphoning money. My jewelry, my clothes, my hairdo, the shoes. Someone accused me of having as many shoes as Imelda Marcos, which I said, thank you. I would have thought the gay communities would have appreciated that, and so you could sort of tell who was writing it. But I laughed about it. So people really picked on those kinds of things in ways they would never have done with a man, and not just in those, not just in the sort of rags. I mean, I had people at the Washington Post write a story about me. I'll never forget this. I nearly died. And this is by a credible journalist, and this is in the Washington Post, that talked about that I was 46 years old and my hair still touched my shoulders. I will never forget it as long as I lived. I was like, are you serious?
Right.
I mean, what are you? I mean, this is on the top. This is in the paper on the top of the fold, and they're talking about my hair. Are you? But yes, it happened a lot, and even in cover stories in the Atlanta paper, in the Journal Constitution, someone did a lovely piece, and it was actually a woman writer who was excellent, but she said, she started off saying Sandy Thurman is not exactly what you would think of when you're an activist, that she is she's in, whatever, in Gucci shoes and a big yellow diamond on her finger, and not Doc Martens and something else. But it was that constant sort of struggle, I think, from folks externally to not be able to reconcile that the book didn't, match the cover.
Right.
And I think that's a wonderful thing.
I think so too. I mean, because and people will say, well, God, it's such a contradiction. You always reminded me of Benny Prim. And I'll never, and I don't, Dr. Prim.
That's the biggest compliment anyone could have ever given me.
One of the things that, I started out doing my work in Washington, D.C. And then I moved to San Francisco and did work out there, did national work. And now I really work primarily in rural communities, in Appalachia specifically, but we're broadening more to rural America. One of my questions for you is, how do we get rural America to understand or invest in HIV in this moment? Because you don't know this, but we just, there was an event about 3 weeks ago called Healing Appalachia. 25,000 people. It's not, if not the largest, one of the largest open air country music concerts on the East Coast. Tyler Childress was there. The guy who sings Tennessee Whiskey was there. Chris Stapleton was there. And 25,000 people camp out overnight. So we did HIV testing for the first time. We did a small sample. This is the first year, and we'll do it bigger next. 141 people were tested for HIV and Hep C. We had 2 reactive for HIV, didn't know. 14 people reactive for hepatitis C. 4 said they thought so, and the other 10 knew. And then we had a battery of STIs. Now, the challenge is that much of rural America still believe that HIV is a very urban and gay problem, not a problem or a challenge associated with substance use disorder, which I believe to be that 24% of cases we keep saying we can't find. I think because we're looking in the wrong place. Can you help me figure out my strategy to go talk to rural America in this moment?
Well, it's never going to be easy, but I do think we have to normalize HIV testing, just like we are testing for Hep C, just like we're testing for STDs, just like we're testing for diabetes and for hypertension. We, I think, have got to integrate HIV into the other services that we're providing, particularly in places where services are scarce. And it helps us to be able to do all of that stuff at one time. And there are a number of pilots that we're doing, not necessarily with HIV, but there some friends of mine are doing with diabetes and hypertension out in West Texas. So because people are not getting diagnosed and treated. I mean, these are treatable diseases, and they cost a bloody fortune when somebody starts having kidney failure. You know, you can pay for the whole program on what it takes to take care of one patient. So I think normalizing HIV testing, because we've really normalized HIV. So I think when we begin to, in some ways, I mean, there's still stigma, there's still misperceptions and misconceptions, but I think normalizing the testing and applying that with others makes it easier for people to get tested, just as you did in West Virginia at the concert. I mean, people will come in and get tested. And if HIV is just one of the things they're getting tested for, I think people are more comfortable with it. And it's also more efficient when we can do that.
You know, and so you mentioned that, and one of the bigger challenges that we have is that in rural America, we have about 2,300 rural hospitals and clinics. We've been losing about 10% per year over the last decade. It is now projected that we will probably lose approximately 300 or better, 328 of those over the next 18 months, with more to be lost precipitously over the next 5 years. My question for you is, how do I fill that void of access to actual care? Now, I know that you do a lot of work with local hospitals and clinics, you know, one of those being, for example, Larry Lehman's group. Like, I think that they're a great model.
They are a great model.
And I think that they could do more around, like, hub and spoke around behavioral health. That maybe what we do is that they don't need all of the administrative infrastructure. Maybe they are supported by a spine that is someone like Larry's groups, and they do this other hub and spoke model. What do we do in response to these hospital and clinics that are going to close across rural communities?
I think we're going to have to do the hub and spoke kinds of services and root them in community organizations. And then we're going to have to use AI, and we're going to have to use outreach, and we're going to have to use the telephone, and we're going to have to use all these other, whatever it is that we can get our hands on to connect folks to care. And again, these are treatable diseases. So we're going to have to develop referral models, just like we did in Africa when we were doing HIV work in Africa. The majority of places that we worked, or not the majority, but many places that we worked were 40 miles or 60 miles or 100 miles away from anything else. So we're going to have to come up with creative solutions, actually modeling some that we've already created to serve people in rural America. And I don't think there's any other way to do it at this point in time, because so many people have left rural America. And for those left behind, it's going to be really important for us to find some ways to connect. And again, we're going to have to bind to existing structures, whether those are churches or other kinds of groups, or the feed store. I got to tell you, they're going to have some kind of tractor supply place in every place in rural America that you can, so who is it that we partner with to help us get these life-saving tests and services to people?
Because I keep saying, and everybody in my office now laughs at me. Everybody, because I say a healthy Main Street, right, is a healthy America, is a healthy economy. And I think that what we keep forgetting about is that these are the workers that are the backbone of the American economy.
Absolutely.
And if we don't take care of rural America, those are our farmers, those are how you eat. I mean, these things are connected in a way, I think, that we don't always want to recognize. I think one of my challenges in rural communities is the level of stigma of believing that HIV is still someone else's problem. It's an urban problem, or it's a gay problem. And I'm like, no, it's a substance use disorder challenge that we have. And I think that until we start to educate those substance use disorder providers that are out there, MAT providers, buprenorphine, Suboxone, and methadone, to get them engaged in HIV services. I think that binding that you're talking about, I worry that we won't make it to where we need to get to. I know we're getting ready to close out with you, but you hit the nail on the proverbial head. For that is the work that we do in rural America, is that we believe at Community Education Group that so many of the things that we need to do, everything from telemedicine to telehealth to figuring out how to use community health workers better and well, but how to use nurse practitioners to provide primary care, we learned from Africa. And so often people believe that we are giving everything to Africa. That's, well, we can't give them the world. We can't get, but we have actually extracted a lot of some of our best healthcare and learning.
Absolutely.
What is the best thing that you learned about from your global work?
That there is absolutely no reason for us not to be able to give state-of-the-art healthcare and medicines to people in the farthest reaches of our country. We did it in Africa, where this expanse is vast, and we can do it here. And I can remember someone saying at one point in time, early on in the epidemic, that we couldn't give treatment, we couldn't give drugs to people in Africa because they couldn't tell time. Well, we proved them wrong. And we proved them wrong in Africa, and we proved them wrong in South America. Folks want to be healthy. And all we have to do is figure out a way to touch base with them and then be consistent about reinforcing that. It's all about relationships. We can reach them. And most of these drugs we can send to people, and they don't have to, once a month or once every 3 months. We can do that with a great distance and not a lot of money. And we just need to be smart about it.
Right.
We've proven it in Africa and all over the world.
Well, we're about to wrap up, and I don't think we could wrap up without talking about, I think, one of our movement heroes, and I think, I always say he was your friend, but I think he certainly was more than that, and that's A. Cornelius Baker, who we recently lost. And he was, when I met Cornelius, he actually was a Republican, but was always a warrior for the people. Can you tell us about Cornelius?
Cornelius Baker was absolutely one of a kind. He was such a brilliant and bright light. Do we need to stop that?
No.
Okay. He was a brilliant and bright light, and another person I think who people often underestimated because he was so incredibly smart. But he had a wicked sense of humor and great appreciation of the arts, always made people at home, and could bring diverse populations and people together better than anyone I've ever known in my life. And he had more impact and crossed more boundaries than almost anybody I've known in the AIDS epidemic.
And so, if where do you think we're going to find our next Cornelius?
Well, I'm not sure we'll ever find another Cornelius, but I think, he was so adamant about investing in young people, and particularly in young black men, to ensure that they had the experience and developed the skills to make the kinds of contributions that he made during his time. And I think he was such an incredible mentor and exemplar to all of these really fine, smart young men. And that was reflected in his memorial service when all of these, gorgeous kids that he had mentored all these years, and now I can say kids because I'm old, but I mean young men who I've known since they were teenagers practically, who paid homage to him in that moment. Yeah. And I think that's it. I think we need to look at the younger generation who have been mentored by people like Cornelius, right, because there are extraordinary young people there.
Can you give me one story about Cornelius, and I'm going to say that we can actually publish?
Yes, well, that's kind of hard. But I do have to say that Cornelius told a very funny story that it might be true. we don't remember it the same way. So,
Okay.
this is one of those things like the scene of the crime. Nobody remembers it the same way. But when I was executive director of Aid Atlanta, which is when I met Cornelius, he was sent down to visit me by Dr. Sullivan, Lewis Sullivan, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, for whom Cornelius was working at the time. And so I knew Dr. Sullivan from Atlanta, from Morehouse, and he said, Cornelius, you've got to go down and you've got to meet with Sandra McDonald and Sandy Thurman, two Sandys. And he was fine, said fine. So he swears that when he came to visit me, that I was sitting at my desk, I kept him waiting for an hour, which I know wasn't true, but I probably kept him waiting for some time. And that he could hear me on the phone and said, Sandy says, he said, Sandy said, honey, I've got to go because there's some damn Republican sitting out there in my office waiting for me, and I've got to go be nice to him. And so, could have been true. But anyway, we met, and I thought, okay, he was so charming and wonderful. And I thought, well, how am I get to know this person? And so I thought, well, the only way I really can get to know this Republican, first of all, I'd never met a gay Republican that I knew of, and I'd certainly never met a black Republican. So he was, for coming to visit me, I was very excited about it. But I didn't know what to do with him, so I decided we should go drinking in the middle of the afternoon. And of course, I thought, he's looking at me and shaking his head, trying to figure out who is this woman.
Right.
So I decided I'd take him on a gay pub crawl. And we started in one place, and we started drinking about 2:00 in the morning. And I poured him on the plane at 9:00 at night. He didn't even remember flying home.
Wow.
So he was, and it was great because first of all, I don't think he expected some blonde broad to be able to drink him under the table. Well, it happens to be my Irish heritage, which has also allowed me to be able to do that.
Right.
But that I would be well known and loved and given free drinks in every single gay bar in town that we went to.
Well, that's in part because you owned
Bulldogs.
Right.
Yes, so I sort of, so my husband and I did own the mothership, but he was absolutely shocked. And when I finally took him in our last stop to Bulldogs, I just walked in and walked behind the bar. I didn't tell him anything about the fact that I had any interest in the place. And so I just walked in and walked behind the bar and picked up the bottle and started pouring. And he's looking at me like, what the hell? Right. Who is this woman? Anyhow, that was how we got to know each other. And he used to tell that story all the time about how I got him drunk and poured him on a plane. But we were friends for life after that.
Well, very good.
That was a great story.
And that, and I think that's a great way to close this, and a great way to honor him, because he enjoyed a great cocktail.
He did enjoy a great cocktail, and he absolutely enjoyed getting to know people, going any place different, and it didn't matter who he was. He was absolutely happy to go out and get to know somebody under any circumstances and never turned anyone away.
That's true. I had many a lunch with him of trying to figure out something or trying to work out something, and him going, darling, I just don't think that's the right idea.
Exactly.
So, Sandy, again, thank you so very much for everything that you've honestly done, not just for Atlanta or for Georgia or for the country, actually for the globe, because your work has had global impact. And I don't know if people say thank you enough, and I don't know if people acknowledge that I know how difficult it had to be you to do what you did.
Thank you. Well, I was very lucky, and I'm really glad I made the decisions I did. My life could have looked very different, and I'm so grateful every day that I didn't take that path.
Perfect. Thank you so much for spending time with me.
Thank you.
All righty.